The Village of Varnholt! The village of Varnholt had always been a place of quiet decay, its cobbled streets worn smooth by time and the slow, inexorable passage of forgotten years. Nestled in a hollow where the hills curved like the ribs of some long-dead beast, the village seemed to exist outside the natural order, its buildings leaning as if burdened by unseen weight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, something that clung to the very stones and whispered in the wind. The sky above was a deep, unbroken blue, but it felt wrong. Too vast, too silent, as though it watched with unseen eyes. The village had never been a place of prosperity. Even in the days when it had been a thriving port, its people had spoken in hushed tones of things that should not be known. The old sailors had told stories of ships vanishing without a trace, of strange lights flickering in the distance, of figures that moved through the mist like shadows cast by no sun. The villagers had long since abandoned those tales, but the memory of them still clung to the place, like the scent of rot after a storm. Now only a handful of people remained, their lives measured in the slow decay of their homes and the slow erosion of their sanity. It was in this place, this hollowed-out remnant of a forgotten past, that the first signs of something ancient and terrible began to stir. The wind that had once carried the scent of salt and sea had turned to something colder, something that carried with it the weight of something unseen. The villagers spoke in murmurs now, their voices hushed, as if afraid to wake something that had long been sleeping. There were no new stories, only the old ones, the ones that had been passed down through generations and never forgotten. And then there were the whispers. At first, they were little more than the rustling of leaves or the distant cry of a bird, but soon they became something more. They came from the corners of the village, from the cracks in the walls, from the depths of the old library that stood at the heart of Varnholt. They were not the voices of the living, but something else, something that had been waiting, watching, waiting, watching, waits of the right time to rise again. Were beginning to unravel. Eleanor Voss. Eleanor Voss had never belonged to Varnholt, not in the way that the village had belonged to her. She had been born in a city far from these hills, in a place where the air was thick with the scent of industry and the streets were lined with glass and steel. She had come to Varnholt only once before, as a girl of 10, when her grandmother had insisted that she see the place where her mother had once lived. It had been a cold and distant memory then, a place that her mother had spoken of only in whispers, as if the very name of Varnholt was a thing to be feared. Now, as an adult, Eleanor had returned. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. She was a historian, a Lun, not of the curious. Specialist in the esoteric and the obscure, and Varnholt had become the subject of her latest research. The village had long been a place of interest to scholars, though few had dared to remain for long. It was said that the old texts, the ones that had once filled the library that now stood at the heart of the village, had been lost to time, or worse, to something that had taken them. But Eleanor had found a single reference in an obscure manuscript, a mention of a forgotten tome that might still be hidden within the crumbling walls of the library. If it was true, if the book still existed, it could be the key to understanding the strange and terrible history of Varnholt. Her mother had left Varnholt when she was still a child. But she had never forgotten it. She had spoken of the village in riddles, of the things that had once been there and the things that had been taken. She had warned Eleanor not to return, not to look too closely. But Eleanor had always been drawn to the unknown, to the places where history had left its mark. She had spent years studying the myths that surrounded Varnholt, the stories that had been passed down through generations, as she had come to believe that there was more to the village than the old tales would allow. Now, as she stood at the edge of the village, than the old tales would allow. Now, as she stood at the edge of the village, watching the wind stir the dust of forgotten years, she felt the weight of her mother's warnings pressing against her. She had come to Varnholt seeking answers. She had warned in years, repulsing and passed down through generations, and she had come to believe that there was more to the village than the old tales would allow. Now, as she stood at the edge of the village, watching the wind stir the sicking, ready for the truth, the Forgotten Tome! The library stood at the heart of Varnholt, a structure that had not been touched by time or the passage of years. Its walls, though cracked and weathered, still bore the weight of history, and its shelves, though half empty, seemed to hold the whispers of the past. Eleanor stepped inside, her breath shallow, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the doorway as if it might burn her. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of old paper and something older still, something that clung to the very air like a forgotten memory. She had come here in search of the book, the one that had been spoken of only in hushed tones. The villagers had never seen it, had never even known if it still existed. But Eleanor had found a reference in a manuscript, A single line that had sent a shiver down her spine. The book that was never written. The knowledge that was never meant to be known. She had followed that line, through the dust and decay of forgotten libraries, through the brittle pages of text that had been written by men who had long since turned to dust. And now, here she was, standing in the library that had once held the knowledge that had been lost to time. She moved through the aisles, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled over the years. The books were not arranged in any order, nor was there any sign of the library's former purpose. It was as if the knowledge had been scattered, hidden, buried beneath the weight of something that had not been meant to be found, and then at the far end of the room she saw it, a single book, wedged between two crumbling shelves, its spine cracked and its cover worn to the point of near disintegration. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the leather-bound cover. The moment her hand made contact, a shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of something deeper, something that had been waiting for her. The book was warm to the touch, though the air in the library was cold. She opened it carefully. The air in the library was cold. She opened it carefully, the pages rustling like the wings of some unseen creature. The text was written in a language she did not recognize, its symbols curling and twisting in ways that defied the natural order. It was not of fear, but of something deeper, something that had been waiting for her. The book was warm to the touch, though the air in the library was cold. She opened it carefully, the pages rustling like the wings of some unseen creature. But something else, something that had been written by hands that had not yet been born. As she read, the words seemed to shift, rearranging themselves before her eyes, forming patterns that made no sense, yet carried a meaning that pressed against the edges of her mind. And then the visions came. She saw the abyss, vast and endless, a place where the stars were not stars, but eyes watching, waiting. She saw the entity, the thing that had once been hidden in the depths of the ocean, the thing that had once been hidden in the depths of the ocean, the thing that had been waiting for the right time to rise again. And in that moment she knew. This was not just a book. This was a key, a door to something that had been locked away for centuries. The library grew colder, thick with the weight of something unseen. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers still curled around the book, as if it might vanish if she let go. The symbols on the pages seemed to shift again, though she had not moved her eyes. A whisper, low and ancient, curled around her ears, not spoken but felt, as though the words had been pressed into the very marrow of her bones. Then the lights in the library flickered, not once but again and again, as if the very electricity that had once powered the village had been disturbed by something older, something that had never been meant to be known. Eleanor turned, her pulse hammering in her throat, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There was nothing there, only the towering shelves, the dust-laden air, the silence that pressed against her like a living thing. But then the silence broke. A sound, deep and resonant like the groan of the earth itself, echoed through the library. It was not a sound that could be heard, but one that could be felt, vibrating through her bones, through the very walls of the building. She turned again, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw it. At the far end of the room where the book had been found, something was moving. A shape, indistinct and shifting like smoke caught in the wind. It was not solid, not in any way that she could comprehend, yet it was there, watching her with a presence that sent a shiver through her spine. It was not a creature, not in the way that men understood creatures. It was something older, something that had existed before the world had been shaped by human hands. The entity's form was fluid, its edges blurred, as if it were not meant to be seen. It was a mass of shifting darkness, of curling shadows that twisted and writhed in ways that defied logic. And yet, within that darkness, there was a shape, something that had once been a thing of flesh and bone, though now it had become something else entirely. It was not a man, not a god, not even a beast. It was the thing that had been forgotten, the thing that had been buried in the depths of the ocean, the thing that had been waiting for the right time to rise again. Eleanor took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to flee from this place, from this thing that had emerged from the pages of the book, but her legs would not move, her body frozen in place as the entity turned toward her, its presence pressing against her like a wave against the shore. It was not speaking, not in any way that she could understand, but she felt its words in her mind, in the very core of her being. It was not a message, but a warning. It was not a threat, but a promise. And in that moment, she knew this was not the first time the entity had awakened. It had been waiting for her, for someone to find the book, for someone to find the book, for some to find the book, for someone to bring it back into the world. Voss had always prided herself on her ability to think clearly, to maintain control, even in the face of the unknown, but the entity had taken that from her, had unraveled the very fabric of her mind with each passing moment. The visions from the book had not stopped. They came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, each one more unbearable than the last. She saw the abyss again, the endless void where the stars were not stars, but eyes watching, waiting. She saw the entity not as a formless mass of darkness, but as something more. Something that had once been a god, a being that had once been a god, a being that had ruled over the deep before the world had been shaped by human hands. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing, to convince herself that it was only the result of exhaustion, the unraveled divines, but eyes watching, waiting. She saw the entity not as a formless mass of darkness, of the isolation that came with being trapped in a place like Varnholt, but the rational part of her mind was slipping away, being consumed by the visions, by the whispers that curled around her like smoke. The entity was not just a presence in the library anymore. It was in her dreams, in the corners of her mind, in the spaces between thoughts. It was watching her, waiting for her to break. She could not sleep. The moment she closed her eyes, the visions returned, more vivid, more insistent. She saw the villagers not as they were now, but as they had once been. Before the entity had taken them, before the entity had taken them, before the madness had spread through the village like a slow, creeping rot. She saw them moving in the streets, their faces twisted, their eyes hollow, their bodies writhing, being consumed, more vivid, more insistent, with something that was not human. And she saw herself not as the historian who had come to Varnholt, but as something else entirely, something that had been taken, something that had been changed. The entity's whispers were louder now, no longer a mere presence in her mind, but a voice that pressed against her thoughts, filling the spaces between her words, her thoughts, her very being. It did not speak in language, not in any way that she could understand, but she felt its meaning, its intent. It was not trying to harm her, not in the way that men understood harm. It was trying to make her understand. It was trying to make her see. And then the visions became something more. She saw herself standing at the edge of the abyss, the entity before her. The entity. Form shifting, its presence pressing against her like the weight of the world itself. It reached for her not with hands, but with something else, something that was not a hand, but a thought, a feeling, a presence that wrapped around her like a shroud. And she felt it. She felt the entity's touch, not as a thing of horror, but as something that was not meant to be resisted. She tried to run, to flee from the visions, from the entity, from the madness that was consuming her, but she could not. The entity had taken something from her, and she could not escape it. She was not the same woman who had come to Varnholt. She was not the same woman who had come to Varnholt. She was something else now, something that had been shaped by the entity's presence. And as the visions continued, as the entity's whispers grew louder, she realized the truth. The entity had not come to Varnholt to take her. It had come to find her, and she was not ready to face it. The village's descent. The village of Varnholt had always been a place of whispers, of half-remembered tales and secrets that had been buried in the dust of forgotten years. But now the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if the very air had been poisoned by something ancient and terrible. The villagers, once a quiet, isolated people, had begun to change. Their eyes, once dull with the weight of time, now gleamed with something unnatural, something that had not been there before. They moved in strange, jerking motions, their limbs twisting in ways that defied the natural order, their voices once softened by something ancient and terrible. And Shibei, the villagers, once a quiet, isolated people, had begun to change. Their eyes, once dull with the weight of time, now dreaves, measured, had become something else entirely, deep, guttural things that echoed through the streets like the calls of unseen beasts. Eleanor watched from the shadows of the library as the village descended into madness. She had tried to warn the few remaining villagers of what was happening, but they had not listened. They had not wanted to listen. The entity had taken hold of them, had wrapped itself around their minds like a second skin. It was not just Eleanor who was being changed. It was the entire village. The first signs had been subtle. Small things, like the way the villagers no longer spoke of the past, of the old stories that had once been passed down through generations. They had stopped speaking of the sea, of the things that had once been seen in the distance, of the ships that had vanished without a trace. They had stopped speaking of anything at all. They had become silent, not out of fear, but because the entity had taken their voices, had stolen them from their lips, had left only a hollow, whispering void in their place. Then came the changes in their bodies. At first it was only the way they moved, the way their limbs twitched as if they were not their own. But soon the changes became more pronounced. Their skin took on a pale, almost translucent hue, as if the light of the sun had been stripped from them. Their eyes, once dark and full of life, now glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Their faces, once familiar, had begun to shift, to warp into something that was not human. They were not becoming monsters. Not in the way that men understood monsters. They were becoming something else entirely, something that had been waiting for this moment for the entity to return. Eleanor had tried to leave, to escape the village before it was too late, but the entity had not allowed her to go. It had taken hold of her, had wrapped itself around her mind, had made her see the truth. She could not run. She could not escape. The entity had taken the village, had taken the people, had taken her, and now she was part of it. The entity's influence spread through the village like a slow, creeping rot. The old buildings, once sturdy and strong, began to crumble, their walls cracking cracking as if the very stone had been weakened by the entity's presence. The streets, once worn, she could not run, she could not escape. The entity had taken the village, had taken the people, had taken the people, had taken her. And now, she was part of it. The passage of time now bore strange, shifting patterns that seemed to move when no one was looking. The air itself had changed, thick with the scent of something old, something that had been buried for centuries. And the entity was not done. It was still waiting, still watching, still preparing for the moment when it would rise again. When the time came, when the world was ready, it would not be alone. It would have the village, the people, the knowledge that had been hidden for so long. And when that moment came, when the entity finally rose, it would not be stopped. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The walls of the library groaned as if the very structure was aware of the presence that had returned. The entity had not come to destroy her, not in the way that men understood destruction. It had come to claim her. She had tried to resist, had tried to run, but the entity had found her. It had followed her through the streets of Varnholt, through the crumbling buildings, through the minds of the villagers, until it had finally reached her, and now there was no escape. She was here, in the place where the book had been found, where the entity had first awakened, and she was not alone. The entity had first awakened, and she was not alone. The entity moved, its form shifting between the shadows, between the spaces between her thoughts. It was not a thing of flesh, not in any way that she could comprehend. It was a presence, a force, a will that had existed before the world had been shaped by human hands, and it had been waiting for her. She could feel it in her mind, in the very core of her being. It was not speaking, not in words that she could understand, but she felt its meaning, its intent. It was not trying to harm her, not in the way that men understood harm. It was trying to make her understand. It was trying to make her see. And she did. She tried to make her see. And she did. She saw the truth. The entity had not come to Varnholt to take her. It had come to find her. It had been waiting for her to return, for her to find the book, for her to bring it back into the world. And now it was here, and she was its chosen one. She tried to fight it, to resist its pull, but the entity was stronger. It had been waiting for this moment, for her to understand. She could not run, could not escape. She was part of it now, as the villagers had become part of it. She had been changed, just as they had. The entity reached for her, not with hands, but with something else, something that was not a hand, but a thought, a feeling, a presence that wrapped around her like a shroud, and she felt it. She felt the entity's touch, not as a thing of horror, but as something that was not meant to be resisted. She had no choice. She had to accept it. She had to become part of it. And as she did, as she let the entity take her, she saw the village, the people, the knowledge that had been hidden for so long. She saw the entity rising, not as a monster, but as something else entirely. Something that had been waiting for this moment, for the world to be ready. And as the entity rose, as the village fell into its embrace, Eleanor knew that she had made her choice. She had not resisted, she had not fought, she had accepted, she had not fought, she had accepted, and the entity had taken her, and now the world was ready. The aftermath. The village of Varnholt had not been destroyed, not in the way that men understood destruction. It had been changed. The buildings still stood, though they no longer bore the marks of time, of decay, of the slow erosion that had once defined them. The streets, once worn smooth by the passage of years, now bore strange, shifting patterns that moved when no one was looking. The air was thick with the scent of something old, something that had been buried for centuries. And the villagers, those who had once been men, women, children, were no longer the same. They had become something else entirely, something that had been waiting for this moment for the entity to return. Eleanor Voss was no longer the historian who had come to Varnholt in search of answers. She was something else now, something that had been changed by the entity's presence, by the knowledge that had been hidden for so long. She had not fought it, she had not resisted, she had accepted, and in doing so, she had become part of it. The entity had not taken her, not in the way that men understood taking. It had claimed her, had wrapped itself around her mind, had made her see the truth. She had not been the first to be taken, nor would she be the last. The villagers had come before her, had been changed, had been shaped by the entity's influence. And now, she was one of them. She no longer walked the streets of Varnholt as she once had. She no longer spoke the language of men, the language of the past, the language of the known. She spoke in whispers, in the language of the known. She spoke in whispers, in the language of the entity. The language of the entity had not taken her, not deemed by, the reaser had been changed, had been shaped by the entity's influence. And now, she no longer walked the streets of Varnholt as she once had. villagers, not as an outsider, but as one of them. She no longer sought answers, no longer searched for the truth. The truth had been given to her, had been taken from her, had been made part of her, and the entity had not stopped. It had not risen, not in the way that men understood rising. It had been waiting, had been watching, had been waiting for the right moment to return. And now the moment had come. The village was no longer a place of whispers, of half-remembered tales and secrets buried in the dust of forgotten years. It was a place of something else, something that had been waiting for this moment, for the entity to return. The entity was no longer hidden in the depths of the ocean, no longer searched for the truth. The entity was no longer searched for the right moment to return. It had returned, had claimed the village, had claimed Eleanor. It was no longer waiting. It was here, and it would not be stopped. And as the entity rose, as the village fell into its embrace, as the world was ready, Eleanor knew that she had made her choice. She had not resisted. She had not fought. She had accepted. And the entity had taken her, and now the world was ready. The endless watch, the village of Varnholt, had become something else entirely, a place where the past and the unknown had merged into a single, unrelenting presence. The entity had not merely returned. It had claimed the village, had woven itself into the village, had woven itself into the very fabric of the land, the people, the air that hung thick with the weight of something ancient and terrible. Once a seeker of knowledge, had become something else as well. She no longer searched for answers, no longer sought the truth that had once driven her to this place. She had found it, had embraced it, had allowed herself to be changed. The entity was not a god, not in the way that men had once believed. It was not a monster, not in the way that stories had painted it. It was something else, something that had existed before the world had been shaped by human hands, before the stars had been named, before the first breath had been taken in the silence of the void. It had been waiting, watching, waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to accept it. And now that moment had come. Of men no longer moved as they once had. They had become part of the entity, had been reshaped by its influence, had become something that could not be understood, could not be resisted. They were not monsters, not in the way that men feared. They were something else, something that had been waiting for this moment, for the entity to return. And the entity had returned. It was no longer hidden in the depths of the ocean, no longer forgotten in the abyss. It had come back, had taken the village, had taken Eleanor. It was no longer waiting. It was here, and it would not be stopped. The world had always been a place of secrets, of things that had been hidden, of knowledge that had been buried in the dust of forgotten years. But now, at porting hidden in the dust of the ocean, no longer hidden in the abyss, it had come back, had taken the village, had taken the village, had taken the village, had taken Eleanor. It was no longer waiting. It was no Joth. The secrets had been revealed, the knowledge had been reclaimed, the entity had returned, and it would not be forgotten again. And as the entity rose, as the village fell into its embrace, as the world was ready, Eleanor knew that she had made her choice. She had not resisted. She had not fought. She had accepted, and the entity had taken her, and now the world was ready. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.